Kia ora guys, I'm Michelle and welcome to episode 2 of my Thru Hiking for Beginners series. In this episode we're going to talk about how I chose my sleeping bag for my thru hike. Choosing a sleeping bag can be a really difficult and in-depth process. There are a number of different options out there, a number of different manufacturers, different fill types, different weights and things that you'll have to take into consideration. And picking the right one that's going to suit you on your thru hike can sometimes be very difficult. So in this video I'm hoping to give you a few pointers of how I decided on my sleeping bag, which might help you decide on which one you want to use when you're completing your thru hike. So before we go any further, I'm going to be right up front with you and tell you that I decided on the Enlightened Equipment Enigma quilt to take with me on my thru hike. Now you might be thinking straight away, well, a quilt is not a sleeping bag. You're absolutely right. Quilts are not something that I've ever used before. This is a brand new venture for me, but I'll go into the details of why I decided to go with the quilt later on. Now this is the 10 degree Enigma. It weighs in at 692 grams. It's made out of 850 fill power goose down, which is treated to repel the moisture, and it's super lightweight, super convenient, and it's also got a sewn in foot box. Now there were two main considerations that I wanted to take into account when choosing either a sleeping bag or a quilt, and both of them were about as important to me as each other. So firstly was the weight. I wanted a quilt that was going to weigh less than a kilogram. I didn't want to really be going over a kilogram in weight. And the second thing was the warmth rating. Now I wanted a quilt that I knew was going to keep me warm down to at least minus 10 degrees Celsius. Now obviously because I was going to prioritize those two things, it meant that I was probably going to have to sacrifice on my budget consciousness a little bit. Typically when you are looking at a sleeping bag that is lightweight and still going to keep you warm down to those minus temperatures, you're going to end up pushing up the price. So I was quite lucky. I managed to pick up this bag for I think around about $350 US, which equates to around about 500 New Zealand dollars, which isn't too bad. But I think it is important to note that there are cheaper sleeping bags out there. It's just that you're probably going to find that they are at least a little bit heavier and potentially are not going to keep you quite as warm. Just depends on your individual circumstances. So before we move on to the specific details of some of the various different sleeping bags that I was looking at, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the considerations that you're going to have to take into account when choosing a sleeping bag. Now probably the first and most obvious is going to be what sort of insulation do you want? When it comes to sleeping bags and quilts, there are two types of insulation. One is synthetic and the other one is down. Now I decided very early on that I wanted to go with a down sleeping bag, and that if possible I wanted to go with a goose down sleeping bag. The main reason why I decided on this was to do with weight. So synthetic insulations and fillings tend to be a lot heavier than down, and they also tend to be a lot less compressible. My only experience prior to having purchased this quilt was to attempt to hike the Pauakai crossing with an old synthetic sleeping bag that I've had for many years, and realizing very early on that when I was trying to compress it down into my pack, which was about a 50-litre pack, it was taking up about 3/4 worth of the space inside the pack. So I really didn't want to go with a synthetic bag unless I knew that it was going to be a very compressible synthetic bag, and at the end of the day I just couldn't find one that I was happy enough with. I also found that it was a lot easier for me to find down sleeping bags or quilts that I knew would pack down into very, very tiny little capsules that I could sit right down in the bottom of my pack and not need to really worry about. The other reason why I decided to choose down is because of its warmth to weight ratio. So down will tend to be a lot warmer than synthetic, and I tend to be a very cold sleeper, so that was a big consideration for me. I also knew that I wanted to have quite a high loft down. So the loft rating refers to basically the amount of air that can get in between each individual fibre of the down. And that's how it determines how compressible it is and how warm it is. Anything above 800 fill power down is generally considered by most people to be a very high quality down. So I think that I did really well to get an 850 fill power quilt for the price that I got it for. You want to be looking not just at the fill power, so 850, 900, whatever it might be, but also how much down is actually stuffed into the sleeping bag as well. So it's quite common for a manufacturer to use a very low fill power down, for example a 600 or 650, but stuff quite a bit more of it into the sleeping bag than you would find on the 800, 900 loft version of the same bag. So again, for me and for my particular considerations when it came to warmth, I knew that I wanted to have as much down stuffed into each of the different baffles in my sleeping bag or quilt as possible, and really again I couldn't go past Enlightened Equipment in this regard. The Enigma has over 500 grams of down actually filled into the quilt itself. This is subordinate really only to the Feathered Friends Petrol 10 UL, which has over 600 grams of fill stuffed into it. Now another one of the major considerations that I had to make when it came to choosing a sleeping bag was how well it was going to perform in a damp environment. Throughout this whole process, I've been very, very conscious of the fact that I am going to be through hiking in New Zealand, where the climate is not only changeable but also very, very damp in a lot of different sections. This has been a prime consideration for me when I've been trying to decide on which tent or shelter that I'm going to use, but also super, super important for deciding on items of my gear that are going to be filled with down. Now down has come a long way in over the past 5 to 10 years. You'll find that in a lot of circumstances these days, when you are paying a good price for a product that is filled with down insulation, you're more than likely going to have down that is either hydrophobic or coated with a certain substance that's going to help it to repel moisture. Now I think that this is pretty much a non-negotiable when you're considering hiking in the New Zealand environment. Whereas it doesn't mean that you're going to be able to soak your sleeping bag in a gallon of water and still be able to keep warm in it. It does mean that, you know, if the inevitable happens and you end up in a tent that's absolutely full of condensation, which then starts to drip onto your sleeping bag, at least you're still insulating yourself a little bit from the risks of hypothermia. Now again, me being a particularly cold sleeper and me not being a very experienced hiker and never having completed an overnight tramp before, I wanted to make sure that I am covering all of my bases when it comes to keeping myself warm and dry. And that being said, a lot of the sleeping bags and quilts that I was considering, including these ones from Enlightened Equipment, also have a nylon outer that is coated with DWR or durable water repellent, which basically helps the water to bead up on the outside and roll off, which helps to keep the bag slightly more water resistant. I have to admit, I did do a lot of backwards and forwardsing between do I go with a synthetic bag or do I go with a down bag. I'm not particularly happy with using a down bag in the damp and wet New Zealand environment just in case it does get wet because I don't have another redundancy. I again decided at the end of the day to go with down as long as it had all of these other redundancies with it. But I think it is really important to note that you do have to take extra precautions to keep your sleeping bag really dry whilst you're hiking in an environment like this. I have to say that the Enlightened Equipment quilt comes with a beautiful little stuff sack, but I will probably end up buying myself another, either a dry bag or a specific waterproof stuff sack for my sleeping bag, just as, like I say, an extra redundancy to make sure that it doesn't ever get wet. Now, for a lot of beginners out there, you've probably never even heard of a quilt. I certainly never had. So our family has been camping for many decades. I grew up in a family that used to go camping all the time, and we've always generally either had rectangular sleeping bags or mummy bags. They've always been synthetic. So I've never really had an experience of anything other than that. I was super excited when I was about 13 years old to get my very own mummy bag, which was a 4-season mummy bag, I think. Super warm, super comfortable, but I very quickly became very conscious of the fact that my old, very trusty sleeping bag just was not going to be suited at all to what I am planning to do over the coming summer. I knew that I was going to end up having to buy a new sleeping bag anyway. I was looking at the Z-Packs Classic sleeping bag to start with. Now the Z-Packs Classic is very similar actually to the Enigma quilt. The main difference being that it's got a full length zip on it. Now of course a full length zip means just a little bit of extra weight, which pushes the weight of the bag up a little bit. And in my head I was thinking to myself, no, I don't want to add any extra weight whatsoever. I'm sure that I can make do with a 10-degree Fahrenheit bag, which will be about -12 degrees Celsius, which I then have the option of either cinching down around my sleeping pad and basically sealing it all in anyway, or just leaving it completely open. So typically when I've been camping, I have always been one of these people who has the bag unzipped and sort of just thrown over me, and the main problem with that is that you end up with a hood on one side that you end up getting tangled in, and inevitably you can't get the zip done back up again at the bottom, and it just all becomes a bit of a tangled mess. So the idea of a quilt immediately appealed to me. I started looking at the Enlightened Equipment Revelation, which is a full quilt. It will open right the way out into basically a rectangular piece of material which you can just throw over the top of you, and when you want to use it as a bag you can cinch up the foot box using a draw cord, and it will basically close everything in at the bottom, and then you can use it like a sleeping bag. My main concern with that is that if any part of my body is going to get cold when I'm asleep, it's generally going to be my feet, and I just felt that having even just a tiny little hole in the bottom where the bag has been cinched together was going to create too much of a draft, which was basically just going to mean that I was going to be uncomfortable all night long if it was cold enough. So that brought me around to the Enigma. Now the Enigma has a sewn in footbox, and that's the same also with the Z-Packs Classic. So I wanted to focus on having that sewn in footbox very early on. That means that I can shove my feet down into a little compartment in an enclosure and basically keep them in there, and hopefully they're going to keep themselves really nice and toasty warm even on a very cold night. I can then use other redundancies like wearing a puffy layer in bed, or wearing merino base layers and things like that, beanies, gloves, all that sort of thing on a really cold night to keep the rest of my body warm. Okay, so let's just run over quickly some of the other sleeping bags and quilts that I considered and their specifications, so that you can get an idea of what's out there and what types of bags that I was actually looking at. So as I mentioned, really the first major contender to the Enigma that I was considering was the Z-Packs Classic sleeping bag. Now it's very similar to the Enigma. It does have 950 fill power down instead of the 850 of the Enigma, but again that down is treated with a hydrophobic substance to allow it to repel water better. The outer is a 7D ripstop nylon with a DWR coating as well, so it has all of those water protection redundancies that I was talking about earlier. Now the Z-Packs Classic does come in at lighter than the Enigma, so despite the fact that it's got the full length zip, it comes in at about 671 grams. So there are some other really great sleeping bags out there that you might want to consider. So the first one that I'm going to cover is the Thermarest Hyperion 20. Now I have to admit that this wasn't really too much in the running for me when I was picking my sleeping bag. As I said, I'd pretty much already decided on a Z-Packs or an Enlightened Equipment anyway. But the Thermarest Hyperion is actually a really good option. So again, it's got that hydrophobic down, and it's got a 900 fill power with a 10D ripstop nylon with DWR finish coating on the outer. Now this weighs in at quite a bit lighter than some of the other bags that I've been talking about, coming in at 580 grams, and that's because it doesn't have as much fill in it. So this bag is a 20 Fahrenheit or around about a -6 bag. So I actually really wanted my sleeping bag or quilt, whatever I decided on, to go down to at least -5, and if not more like -10 degrees Celsius. And again, that's because of my own personal experience. I know that I'm a cold sleeper, and so I wanted to just add that extra redundancy. But there is a really good option if you do want to go with the Thermarest Hyperion, is to just buy yourself a sleeping bag liner. Now, Thermarest also makes some really great sleeping bag liners that you can put down inside, and they can actually increase the temperature rating by up to about 10 degrees Celsius. So they can be a really good option if you want to go with a lighter or a cheaper sleeping bag, but you're still a little bit concerned about how warm it's going to keep you. Just bear in mind though that what you are making up for in warmth with the sleeping bag liner, you're also taking away from when it comes to weight in your pack. So a sleeping bag liner will probably weigh in the region of about 200 grams depending on what you decide to get. Feathered Friends is also a really well-known brand of ultralight and even just general lightweight sleeping bags. I looked at two different models of the Feathered Friends. One was the Petrol 10 and the other one was the Lark 10. Now again, on comparison to things like the Enigma, the Z-Packs, and even the Thermarest Hyperion, they come in very, very close. So we're still looking at 950 fill goose down, 15D ripstop nylon, and the Pertex Endurance Ultralight outer on the outside. Now the weights of these two bags are quite substantially more than the Enlightened Equipment bags and also the Z-Packs bags. The Lark comes in at around about 880 grams and the Petrol is just over 900. So I was really going to be pushing the limit of my weight allowance there if I went with one of these bags. Now for those of you who live in New Zealand, as I do, and don't visit the US on a regular basis, you might find it a little bit difficult to get things like the Enlightened Equipment or Z-Packs products over here for a very cheap or very convenient price. We do have options here in New Zealand for sleeping bags. In my experience, they tend to be, certainly out of the high street stores, a lot heavier than a kilogram. In most cases, you're looking at anywhere between a kilogram and 1.5 kilograms. But there are some lightweight options out there. I would definitely recommend you check out the MacPack Epic 400. This is by far and away one of the better sleeping bags that I've come across in terms of warmth to weight ratio and also general overall weight. So this is once again a Hyperdry 800 fill goose down, which is still really, really good, with a Pertex Quantum outer, which is going to help repel that water off. The temperature rating goes down to -1 degree Celsius, which again probably for me is not good enough, but if you're looking at having a sleeping bag liner, you can drop that temperature rating even lower. And it does come in at just under that 1 kilogram mark, sitting at 920 grams. So I think that's a really good option for somebody who's just starting out. It's not too bad price wise, and they are readily available at any MacPack store in New Zealand. I checked out Kathmandu, and a lot of their sleeping bags again are in around about that 1.3 kilogram mark. But if you know of any others and you want to make recommendations, please feel free to leave them down in the comments below, not just for other viewers' benefit, but also so that I can take a look as well. Okay everybody, so that is it for this episode, and I hope that you found some of this information really useful. It's an absolutely freezing cold day here in Taupo, New Zealand, where I'm making this video today, and so I've really benefited from being able to snuggle up into my Enlightened Equipment Enigma quilt. I know there's a lot of people out there who are very keen to see how I get on with this on my first overnight tramp. I'm still tossing up whether or not to venture out in the next 6 weeks or so, but we are in the depths of our winter here as well now, so I'm not even sure that my Enigma here is going to be enough to keep me warm, but we'll see. So I hope that this has helped to clarify for you some of the different considerations that you'll want to take into account when choosing a sleeping bag or a quilt for something like a thru hike. I'm learning by experience here a little bit, and I know it was very, very confusing for me, So hopefully by setting out what my process was and what some of my considerations were, that might help you to make a better decision too. In the next episode of my Thru Hiking for Beginners series, I'm going to be covering off how I'm deciding on a tent. I still haven't purchased my tent yet, but I do have a very good idea of which tent I'm going to go with, so make sure you stick around for that. In the meantime, if you find yourself lacking for outdoor inspiration and things during the week, don't forget to go and check out some of the older videos here on my channel. And if you like following along on a slightly more regular basis, then please go and like my Facebook page and follow me on Instagram, and you'll get some pretty well daily or every other day updates from me too. Okay guys, it's been great having you along, and I will catch you next time.